So good afternoon, and welcome to this briefing with Ms. Valerie Amos, who, as you know, is the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. Obviously, it's been an extremely busy morning, and the focus has been on Syria. Ms. Amos is here to brief you on her most recent visit to the region, obviously including Syria. So please, Ms. Amos, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I've just completed a 2-day visit to Syria. My purpose was to seek agreement on arrangements that would enable humanitarian organisations to reach people in areas affected by intense fighting and violence. In Damascus, I met the Syrian Foreign Minister, the Deputy Foreign Minister, and the Ministers for Health and Education. I raised my deep concerns regarding the humanitarian situation with them and put a proposal to the government to conduct needs assessments to get a better sense of what was happening in the country. I also supported the ICRC's call for a daily humanitarian pause. I was able to visit Homs and parts of the suburb of Baba Amma, accompanied by the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, so that I could see for myself the impact of the fighting. In Baba Amma, I was horrified by the destruction I saw. No building was untouched, and there was clear evidence of the use of heavy artillery and tanks. Baba Amma was almost deserted, a few people in tears as they tried to salvage a few possessions. I'm extremely concerned as to the whereabouts of the people who have been displaced from Baba Amma by the shelling and other violence. I was told that some 50 to 60,000 people used to live in the area. We need to know what has happened to them, where they are now, and what they need. We also need to know where the wounded are and whether they are receiving treatment. The government of Syria has said that they need more time to consider my proposals, and themselves proposed a joint and initial humanitarian assessment exercise to take place towards the end of this week. This is a minimal start. We need much, much more. We need a robust and regular arrangement which allows humanitarian organisations unhindered access and time to assess humanitarian needs. And of course, we then need access to allow us to bring in the supplies that people need. We need to be able to evacuate the wounded and deliver desperately needed supplies immediately and without danger to humanitarian workers or the people they're trying to reach. After I left Syria on Friday, I went to Turkey, where I had the opportunity to see the facilities for displaced Syrians in Hatay province on the Turkish side of the border. These facilities currently host around 12,000 Syrian refugees in 7 camps, and there are up to 250 new arrivals every day. I talked to people who had recently arrived from Syria who said that they had to flee for their lives during government military operations. They demanded that the international community take action to stop the violence in Syria. I also met the Turkish Foreign Minister and we discussed regional contingency planning efforts. I had consultations with the Lebanese and Jordanian governments when I was in the region prior to my visit to Syria. I commend all 3 governments for keeping their borders open for people in distress and for providing relief to them in a sustained manner. Since I was in Syria, we've heard and seen disturbing new reports of shelling and tank fire in other cities, including Idlib in the north, and reports of civilian casualties. The people of Syria need our help. They want peace, security, and stability so that they can get on with their lives. We must do everything we can to stop the violence and end the suffering of people caught in the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions, please. Yes, and then Masoud. Then Evelyn. Yeah.
Thank you, Martin. Madam Amos, now we just followed the Security Council meeting, and it seems like this inaction in the Security Council will continue indefinitely. Meanwhile, what do you think is the way to get the humanitarian needs to the people of Syria? Is there any other way to actually, open humanitarian corridors or act without the Security Council approval? Thank you.
We are getting some aid to people now. You will know that the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, for example, are very active on the ground, and they are being supported in terms of supplies, for example, by a number of UN organizations. My major concern is that we are all stretching their capacity, that the number of agencies that are actually able to operate in country is very small. And of course, we have not been able to get into all of the places that we would wish to. It's partly about security, but it is also about the fact that the UN agencies need permission to go into certain areas. On your point about humanitarian corridors, I think I should make it absolutely clear, first of all, that delivering humanitarian assistance does not depend on a Security Council resolution. If we have the agreement of the authorities in Syria, we can deliver humanitarian assistance. What a Security Council resolution would be needed for would be to establish safe zones or humanitarian corridors in Syria, because of course they would have to be policed in some way so that people felt safe and secure.
Masood, and then Abel.
Ms. Amos, thank you very much for this press conference on behalf of UN Correspondents Association. I'd like to know, from what you have said so far, was there any sort of an agreement reached between you and the Syrian government on finding these people who are injured, who have disappeared, missing, who have disappeared? Was there any concrete agreement that you can talk about that, yes, this is a way, has been a way forward at all? Or was there nothing that you can say that the Syrian government cooperated with you, and that there was total lack of cooperation? Was there cooperation?
First of all, I think it's important to say that the Syrian authorities made it clear to me that I could go anywhere that I wished. And you will know that I was the first person to be able to get into Bab Amma and was able to take the Syrian Arab Red Crescent with me. On the issue of an agreement, I put a set of comprehensive proposals, which the Syrian authorities said that they needed more time to consider and consult on within their government. They, however, wrote back to me and made the proposal for this initial joint assessment mission, which I hope will get off the ground at the end of this week.
Okay, Evelyn, and followed by Stefano.
There are reports that the Syrian government is shooting at aid workers and at the wounded and those trying to help the wounded. Did you get evidence of that, or did you see that, or did you mention that?
I did not see that. What I do know is that humanitarian workers have come under fire, and we saw, for example, a few weeks ago that the head of the branches of one of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent was killed. We don't know who was responsible for that. And of course, from my perspective, it's important that all parties engaged in violence and in fighting recognize that humanitarian workers should not be targeted, nor should innocent civilians be targeted.
Okay, next up is Stefano, followed by Errol.
Yes, Mrs. Amos. Just the foreign minister of Russia said that the problem there is that there are other people there have weapons. He's talking also, he mentioned Al-Qaeda. He said that there are people with weapons, and this is the problem at the moment in Syria. When you were there, did you, in talking with people that were suffering, that was asking for help, did they tell you about other people, a part of the security forces or people that coming from the government? Did you have anybody mentioning to you that they were suffering, or they were shot at, or they were victim of terrorists or any other forces that are not connected with the government? Okay.
I had no one say to me specifically that they had been the victim of terrorists. However, when I was in Homs, not in Bab Amma, but in another part of Homs, I came out and spoke to a number of men who were gathered in the street who indicated to me that they had been shot at, for example, or had been made the target of violence by opposition forces.
Okay, next up is Errol, followed by Tim.
Thank you, Martin. Ms. Amos, has been reported, Al Jazeera reported that you have said that Homs is a destroyed city. Now, after visiting Syria, what can you tell us about it, whether it's really destroyed or not? And much has been said in the previous process. People compared the situation in Syria with the wars in Balkans. Your counterpart, Foreign Minister of Turkey, Mr. Ahmet Davutoglu, several times said that. Many people compare that with Srebrenica. What can you say about that?
First of all, I did not say that Homs was devastated. I said Baba Ama was, which is an area in Homs. What I saw in Homs overall was a city which was extremely quiet. There were many parts of Homs where there was no one out on the street, where the shops were closed. In one or two neighborhoods, you did see shops open, you did see people moving around, and in Baba Ama, basically, it is totally destroyed. There is not a single building that has not been affected in some way. On this issue of comparisons, I was not in the Balkans during the time of the conflict, but one of the people who did accompany me to Homs and who saw Baba Ama said that it reminded them of Sarajevo.
Right, Tim, followed by Tala.
Thank you, Madam Amos. On your follow-up mission, did the Syrian government write back to you today? When did they get back to you, and how will this be organised? What kind of mission will be the follow-up?
The Syrian authorities came back to me before I left on the issue of the initial assessment mission. We have asked for access to a number of different towns and cities. The UN agencies in country are putting together now the people who can be involved in those assessment missions. What the authorities said in the letter to me was that we could start within a week, which means Thursday, and that is what we are working towards.
Tala.
Secretary, you must have heard what Secretary Clinton has said concerning the killings that's been taken and the attacks on Idlib and Hama and Homs by the regime while they're meeting with Kofi Annan. This morning we have been faced by pictures of tens of children and women killed in Homs. How do you reconcile these pictures and what happened with what you had been told by the Syrian government officials when you were there?
The Syrian government officials that I met indicated to me that in their view there was not a humanitarian crisis in the country, and that they were able to look after the needs of the Syrian people. I expressed my concern about what we have been seeing. Again, I was told that this was propaganda. My view as the person who is responsible for humanitarian affairs for the United Nations is that if innocent civilians are being targeted or are being caught up in the conflict by any of the parties to the conflict, they must be reminded of their responsibilities under humanitarian law. Civilians should not be targeted, nor should humanitarian workers. And we need to make that point very forcefully to whoever is engaged in the conflict in Syria.
If I may follow up, sir. But how do you feel after your efforts, your visit to them, explaining to them the situation, listening to them and to their reasoning, after you leave, these massacres take place?
My job is to try to find a solution and to do my best to get in, to get humanitarian assistance to the people who need it. I am desperately worried about what has happened to the people, for example, who used to live in Homs. We don't know where they are, we don't know what their needs are. Some, of course, will be sheltering with friends or with family. Some may have crossed the border. We don't know, but we need more transparency, more openness. We need to know what is happening to people.
Next question, Benny, followed by Matthew.
Since you were the first and probably the most the highest official to visit Syria, do you think it's possible to A, end the humanitarian crisis, and B, get humanitarian access unless Assad steps aside as demanded for by the Arab League?
I think it's entirely possible to get humanitarian assistance into Syria now if the Syrian authorities agree to it. We don't know what the scale of the humanitarian situation might be and how it might develop over the next few days. It is critical to have a better sense of what is going on. Of course, we know some from the organisations that are able to have some access, but even those organisations are not able to get to all the places that they need to. The Syrian Arab Red Crescent were trying to get into Baba Amma for a few days before I arrived and were able to accompany me into Baba Amma, for example. So that's why pushing for unhindered access is so important.
But that's to follow up, but is all of that possible at all unless Assad steps aside?
It's entirely possible to get that access today if the Syrian authorities were to agree to it.
Okay, Matthew, and then final question, Colin.
Sure, Ms. Amos. While you were there, did you meet with the opposition, for example, the Free Syrian Army? And also, there seems to be this two different narratives. One would say that Assad was attacking these cities, and therefore fighters took up to defend the civilians that were living there. Some others might say that there's a fighting force within the city, and Assad indiscriminately attacks the city to try to get at the fighting force. What do you make of those two? And would you call on armed Free Syria Army fighters to pull out of, for example, Idlib or other places where civilians are?
On meeting the opposition, no, I did not. When I was in Homs, after I had been to Baba Amma, I was told that there were a number of people who had been displaced from Baba Amma who were in an opposition-controlled area of Homs. We tried to negotiate through the Syrian Arab Red Crescent to get access to those people. That negotiation went on for quite a long time, but ultimately we were not able to get access to them. On this issue of the narratives, I have to say that I think the people who are caught up in this and who have become victims of the violence, I don't think that they much care what the narrative is. I think from their perspective, they want the fighting to stop. They want to be able to return to their normal lives. They want peace, stability and security. And that's what, from my perspective, I have to try to deliver. And my call is on everyone who is armed to respect the rights of civilians and to respect the safety and security of humanitarian workers. They should not be caught up in the midst of this violence in the way that they have been.
Last question, Colin.
Thanks. Just a quick question on South Porter Farm. There have been a number of advocacy groups that have been calling for cross-border provision of aid, even if you don't have consent of the government in Khartoum. I'm curious to see what your position on that is, what sort of concerns you have about doing that, what impact it would have, on the UN's ongoing operations in other parts of Sudan.
I've made it clear on many occasions that I do not support cross-border operations unless they are agreed by both governments, the governments of Sudan and South Sudan. And indeed, the government of Sudan have said that they would see any kind of cross-border operation as a hostile act. That is why we have been trying to agree with the government of Sudan and with the SPLM North a cross-line operation which would enable humanitarian access from government-controlled areas into opposition, into SPLM North-held areas, because many of the people that are crossing the border into South Sudan present from those SPLM North-held areas with severe humanitarian needs. So we have put a proposal to the government and we're awaiting their response.
Okay.
The Libyan opposition, Syrian opposition, just issued a statement asking for humanitarian corridors, safe zones, and no-fly zone. We read your letter. Are you still against a secure corridor, even if it saves lives at this moment?
My problem is that I do not see how those corridors can be established in the current context. If you had a if you have a corridor or a safe zone, it has to be made safe so that people feel safe to get there. That means it has to be policed. So if they are within Syria, how are you going to police those safe zones in a situation where you have no Security Council resolution which would allow any kind of intervention into Syria to enable the policing or securing of those safe zones? So I'm not against humanitarian corridors or safe zones per se. I'm asking the question about how are we going to make them work in Syria? How are we going to make people feel safe and secure in the absence of a Security Council resolution which would enable the securing of those zones?
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
This was